The year was 117 CE. Rome stood unmatched. From the misty highlands of Caledonia in the north to the sunburned sands of Arabia in the south, from the cliffs of Lusitania in the west to the wheat fields of Mesopotamia in the east. One empire, 20% of the world's population, stitched together by conquest, roads, and the sheer force of Roman order. At its peak, under Emperor Trajan, Rome had reached a size no Mediterranean power before it had even imagined. But beneath the grandeur lay a flaw. It was too big, too vast, too stretched. The frontiers were endless. The Rhine and Danube rivers marked the edge of civilization, or so the Romans believed, but they were constantly under pressure. Germanic tribes pressed in from the forests. In the east, the Parthians and later the Sassanids tested Roman might with cavalry and cunning. Defending every mile of border required thousands of men, hundreds of forts, and an ocean of coin. Legions were constantly on the move, shuttled from one crisis to the next, leaving regions vulnerable the moment they turned their backs. Supply lines were long and fragile. Communication was slower than death. A message sent from Britain to Syria could take over a month to arrive, and by the time it did, the situation had often changed. Governors acted independently. Generals grew ambitious. Whole regions began to function like mini empires, tied to Rome in name, but barely responsive to its will. Egypt fed the empire with grain, but Alexandria cared more for its trade with the East than for Senate decrees. The same went for North Africa, Hispania, even parts of Gaul. And culture was not a glue, but a patchwork. Rome ruled over Greeks, Gauls, Berbers, Syrians, Jews, Armenians, Celts, and countless others. Latin was spoken in the courts, but local languages filled the streets. Customs clashed, loyalty frayed. The empire was less a single body and more a massive organism filled with competing parts, kept from tearing itself apart only by military power and bureaucratic inertia. To maintain control, Rome built roads. Thousands of miles of them, paved and straight, cutting through forests and mountains. These roads moved armies, but also rebellions and disease and information. With every expansion, Rome increased the strain. Dacia was conquered for its gold, Arabia for prestige. Mesopotamia was attempted, but proved impossible to hold. Each new province brought wealth, yes, but also a need for more legions, more officials, more tax collectors. The cycle never ended. By the end of the 2nd century, cracks had formed. The Antonine Plague swept through the empire, possibly smallpox, killing millions. It exposed a terrible truth. Even Rome could not command nature. Its cities, dense, interconnected, dependent on grain from afar, were ideal breeding grounds for disease. As death spread, manpower fell. Tax revenue declined. Soldiers died. Settlements were abandoned. The empire had expanded so far that it couldn't breathe. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent the final years of his reign not writing meditations in peace, but fighting endless wars along the Danube. Even he could see the horizon darkening. He died in 180 CE. His son, Commodus, inherited an empire already trembling from within. Rome was still mighty, still feared, but it was no longer growing. It had no more room to stretch. Now it began to sag under its own weight. And weight in Rome was everything. Bureaucracy ballooned. Taxation became brutal. Local elites were squeezed to fund distant wars they didn't care about. The more Rome needed to maintain its far-flung territories, the more it depended on governors and generals whose own ambitions outgrew their loyalty. And the more it expanded, the more it relied on people who were not Roman in blood or culture to serve as its limbs. The heart of the empire still beat in Italy, but the pulse was faint. The empire had once been a city with an army. Now it was a territory with a memory. The Senate still met, still passed decrees, but its words echoed down empty halls. Power had shifted to the peripheries, to the frontier forts, to provincial commanders, to men whose names the Senate barely knew, but who held real power in the north, the east, and the south. By the year 200, the Roman Empire had stopped being a conqueror and started being a caretaker. But what it held was too large, too diverse, and too tired. It wasn't one empire anymore. It was many, some still Roman, others just pretending to be. And all of them, every city, every fort, every distant outpost, would soon be tested by what came next. The year was 212 CE. Caracalla, son of Septimius Severus, issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, a sweeping decree that made nearly every free man in the empire a Roman citizen. It was meant to unify. In practice, it diluted what being Roman even meant. Once, citizenship had been a privilege, a marker of identity, a bond of duty. Now it was handed out wholesale, mostly so the state could collect more taxes. A Roman was no longer a man who served Rome. He was a name on a ledger. The army was changing, too. The legions that once marched beneath the eagle had become something else. Recruitment within Italy had dried up. Roman citizens no longer volunteered to fight for an empire they barely understood. The costs were too high, the risks too great, and so the generals turned outward. More and more, the legions were filled by men from the provinces, Illyrians, Thracians, Gauls, even Germans. Foreigners raised under Rome's shadow, many loyal to their officers, not to the emperor in faraway Rome. Discipline suffered. Latin was no longer the shared tongue in every barracks. Cohesion faded. Whole units began identifying by their tribal roots more than their Roman rank. The Praetorian Guard, once the elite protectors of emperors, had become a kingmaker militia, buying and selling the throne as it pleased. In 193 CE, after the death of Pertinax, the Guard auctioned off the emperorship to the highest bidder, Didius Julianus I. He ruled for 9 weeks. Then they murdered him. This was not an isolated event. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire endured what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was not a crisis. It was an unraveling. In 50 years, more than 24 emperors rose and fell. Most were military men. Most were killed, assassinated by troops, betrayed by allies, or slaughtered in battle. Loyalty had become a currency, and emperors could no longer afford it. During this time, the empire fractured. In the west, the Gallic Empire broke away, a Roman rump state made up of Gaul, Britain, and parts of Hispania. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire rose under Queen Zenobia, claiming Syria, Egypt, and Arabia. Rome still held Italy, yes, but it was no longer the center. It was just another territory clinging to power. Trade collapsed. Currency debased. Inflation exploded. Coins were made of bronze with a thin silver wash, worth less with every year. A soldier's pay became meaningless. Barter returned. Cities shrank. Roads decayed. Farmers, unable to survive under crushing taxes and constant threat, fled to the countryside. There, they gave themselves to wealthy landowners in exchange for protection. This was the beginning of the latifundious system, estates that operated as self-contained fiefdoms, where peasants worked not for Rome, but for survival. The state, desperate for revenue, taxed the poor until they vanished. The rich, meanwhile, bought their way out of obligation. The middle disappeared. Even religion was shifting. Mystery cults flourished. Mithras, Isis, Cybele, Eastern gods found homes in Roman hearts. People no longer believed in the old pantheon. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, they were statues in crumbling temples. New faiths offered hope, offered personal salvation. Christianity, illegal but spreading, promised something Rome never could. Eternal life not earned by conquest, but by grace. Persecution only fueled its growth. Martyrs became legends. Rome could kill the faithful, but could not stop their message. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, briefly stitched the empire back together in the 270s. He crushed Zenobia, reclaimed the Gallic territories, built walls around Rome itself. But even his victories spoke to decline. Rome, the eternal city, now needed fortifications. It had once believed no enemy could reach it. Now it prepared for siege. When Aurelian was murdered by his own officers, there was no surprise. Power had become a target, not a position. Rule was temporary, survival uncertain. By 284 CE, when Diocletian seized the throne, Rome was no longer recognizable. He understood that it could not be governed as it had been. One emperor was not enough. One capital was not enough. And so he split it, created the Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors, 2 juniors, 4 rulers for one empire. He hoped to restore order. Instead, he confirmed fragmentation. Diocletian did much to stabilize Rome. He reformed the military, tightened administration, standardized taxes. But he ruled like a god, demanding worship, not loyalty. The emperor was no longer princeps, the first among equals. He was dominus, lord and master, a divine autocrat dressed in silk and jewels, speaking from behind veils, unreachable. The gap between ruler and ruled had become unbridgeable. He abdicated in 305 CE, the first emperor ever to do so willingly. Within a year, his careful system collapsed into civil war. Constantine emerged victorious, uniting the empire again under one man. But even he knew Rome's time had passed. In 330 CE, he founded a new capital, Constantinople on the Bosporus. Closer to trade, closer to wealth, closer to power. The empire had moved east. The west was now the husk. Its city still stood. Its legions still marched. But the soul of the empire had shifted. What had once been a unified colossus was now a two-headed creature. One head turning toward survival, the other toward decay. And yet, through all of this, Rome endured. Not because it was strong, but because it had become too large to die quickly. It staggered forward, held aloft by habit, by inertia, by the remnants of systems built centuries before. But the foundations were gone. The soldiers no longer knew Rome. The emperors no longer ruled from it, and the people no longer believed in it. The fall had begun, quietly, gradually, from within. The year was 376 CE. A ripple began at the edge of the empire, a ripple that would become a wave. The Goths, pressured by a new and terrifying force from the east, the Huns, arrived at the Danube River in desperate flight. They begged entry into Roman lands. Valens, emperor of the East, allowed it. He believed they could be settled as allies, fed, taxed, and turned into soldiers. But corruption broke the plan. Officials starved the refugees, sold them dog meat at outrageous prices, took their children as slaves. What was meant to be asylum became humiliation. Starving and enraged, the Goths rebelled. They moved through Thrace like wildfire. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, Rome met them in force and was destroyed. 2/3 of the Roman army were slaughtered. Valens himself burned in a farmhouse, abandoned by his men. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. And worse, it proved a new truth. Rome could no longer control the tribes it tried to absorb. It had fed the wolf, and now the wolf knew how to bite. After Adrianople, the empire began integrating even more barbarian groups, not as conquered peoples, but as federati, allied tribes with their own leaders, given land in exchange for military service. But these were not Romans. They had no interest in becoming Romans. They lived by their own laws, worshipped their own gods, and followed their own warlords. Rome, desperate for manpower, allowed it. Entire units in the army were now Gothic, Frankish, Allan. The legions weren't Roman anymore. They were a patchwork of mercenaries and strangers, fighting not for the empire, but for gold. This shift had consequences. Loyalty vanished. Commanders no longer answered to emperors, but to their tribal chiefs or personal ambition. The distinction between enemy and ally blurred. Generals like Stilicho and Aetius were half barbarian themselves. They could speak both Latin and Gothic, navigate both camps, and were useful until they became threats. Stilicho, despite defending Italy against repeated invasions, was executed in 408 after rumors of treason. Thousands of his Gothic soldiers were then massacred by Roman mobs. The survivors fled, right into the arms of Alaric. Alaric had once served Rome. Now he turned on it. In 410 CE, he sacked the Eternal City. For the first time in 800 years, Rome fell to a foreign army. It was not burnt to the ground. Alaric still hoped to negotiate, but the symbolism shattered the Roman psyche. The world had turned. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described the moment with despair. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The sack wasn't the end, but it showed that the empire was no longer invincible. Its heart could be pierced. Meanwhile, in the north, Britain was lost. Roman authority collapsed under the weight of constant raids and internal neglect. Troops were withdrawn. Local elites took power. Letters from desperate cities pleading for aid went unanswered. By 410, Emperor Honorius told the Britons to fend for themselves. Rome had abandoned its children. Gaul, too, began to crumble. The Rhine frontier collapsed on New Year's Eve, 406, when a massive coalition of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen river. They rampaged across the provinces, burning, looting, settling. Rome could not stop them. The legions were too few, the loyalty too fractured. Some cities held out. Others welcomed the invaders as a lesser evil compared to imperial neglect. The map of the West began to fracture into tribal kingdoms. Spain fell next. The Suebi and Vandals carved out their own territories. The Visigoths, now semi-settled in Gaul, were used by Rome to fight its enemies and rewarded with land and power. They were becoming something new. Not invaders, not subjects, but rulers. The empire was outsourcing survival. It had no choice. By 455 CE, the Vandals, now settled in North Africa, took to the sea. Led by Genseric, they sailed across the Mediterranean and attacked Rome again. This time they stripped it bare. The sack was brutal. The name Vandal would live on in infamy. Rome had once raised Carthage. Now Carthage returned the favor. And still, the emperors in the West clung to their thrones. But they ruled nothing. The imperial court moved constantly. Milan, Ravenna, always fleeing, always negotiating. The true power lay with generals and kings. Ricimer, a barbarian warlord, installed and deposed emperors like chess pieces. At one point, 3 different men claimed to be emperor. None could command loyalty, none could control the army, and none could save the state. In 472, Rome was sacked again, this time by its own army, under Ricimer's orders. The city that had once ruled continents was now at the mercy of whichever faction held the gates. And outside those gates, new powers were rising. The Visigoths controlled most of Spain. The Franks began expanding in Gaul. The Ostrogoths watched from the east. The Western Empire was no longer a government. It was a memory, carried forward by men who wore purple but wielded no sword. In 476, the farce ended. Romulus Augustulus, a teenage puppet emperor, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general in Roman service. Odoacer didn't declare himself emperor. He didn't need to. He simply ruled Italy in the name of the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, who accepted the fiction because he had no power to stop it. There was no last battle, no grand fall. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a roar, but with silence. Its laws remained in some places. Its coins still circulated, but the machinery was dead. The Senate met, but had no power. The legions existed in name only. Roads crumbled. Aqueducts cracked. Cities emptied. Trade shrank. What had been the heart of the ancient world became a collection of petty kingdoms, ruled by warlords speaking broken Latin and wielding rusted swords. The Roman world had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. It had tried to be eternal, but eternity cannot be stretched across 1,000 miles, 100 tribes, and 2 continents. It had built too much, conquered too far, trusted too blindly, and adapted too slowly. And in the end, it was not slain. It was abandoned. The empire that had once called itself eternal had become hollow. After the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, no armies marched to avenge him. No legions rallied. No senatorial uprising followed. The silence that greeted his removal was deafening, because by then, Rome's fall had already happened in everything but name. In the provinces, Roman governors had been replaced by tribal kings. They spoke some Latin and issued laws modeled on Roman precedent. even minted coins bearing the faces of emperors. But their loyalty was to their own people. The Franks in Gaul, under Clovis, began to carve out a new kingdom. He converted to Christianity, but not to the version practiced in the Eastern Empire. He followed the Latin Church, tying his crown to the Bishop of Rome. In doing so, he forged a new synthesis: barbarian warlord and Roman Christian ruler, united under a different kind of authority. In North Africa, the Vandals continued to rule from Carthage. They controlled the grain supply that once fed Rome, but they had no intention of sharing it. Their navy dominated the western Mediterranean. Italy, starved of shipments, saw its cities wither. The population of Rome itself had fallen from over 1 million at its height to barely 100,000. The aqueducts, damaged in the repeated sacks, ran dry. Public baths closed. Marble buildings stood stripped of metal. Roofs collapsed. Statues defaced or melted down for coinage. Across the old Roman world, decay became the norm. In Gaul, once a rich heartland, the roads fell into disrepair. The great Roman villas were abandoned or turned into crude fortresses. Cities that had bustled with trade and theater became clusters of peasant huts huddled in the shadows of crumbling walls. The elite no longer studied rhetoric. They learned to survive. Latin itself began to splinter. What had once been the tongue of law and poetry fractured into dialects, sowing the seeds of French, Spanish, and Italian. The old institutions of Rome remained in name, but not in function. The Senate still met, but was largely ceremonial, a shadow of itself. Laws were copied, recopied, forgotten. Bureaucrats who once managed tax flows from Spain and Gaul now begged for land from the nearest warlord. The great imperial postal system, the cursus publicus, disappeared. Messages no longer flowed from center to periphery. There was no center. Only the church endured. In Rome, the bishop, now called pope, filled the power vacuum left by emperors. He negotiated with kings, mediated disputes, fed the poor. The church preserved literacy, maintained records, and kept the memory of the empire alive. But even it changed. Christianity, once persecuted, now ruled. Pagan temples were shuttered or converted. Statues of gods were beheaded. The old Roman religion didn't die in a final ceremony. It faded in the face of a new world. To the east, the Byzantine Empire, what had once been the Eastern Roman Empire, watched the Western collapse with wary detachment. Constantinople still stood, rich and fortified, heir to Roman law and Greek culture. But it did not march to save the West. It lacked the will, and perhaps the means. Instead, the East declared that the West had been reabsorbed. Odoacer ruled Italy, yes, but on behalf of the Eastern Emperor. It was a diplomatic lie that masked an irreversible truth. That truth became clearer as decades passed. No effort was made to reconquer Gaul. Spain was left to the Visigoths. Africa remained under Vandal control until Justinian's campaigns decades later, and even then, only temporarily. The old western provinces were not being governed. They were being remembered. By the early 6th century, Italy itself began to fracture further. The Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, took over from Odoacer. Theodoric ruled as a Roman-style king, keeping Roman institutions alive in name. He preserved the Senate, restored some aqueducts, even employed Roman philosophers like Boethius. But beneath the surface, it was not a Roman government. It was Gothic. Its loyalty was ethnic, not civic. When Theodoric died in 526, his successors couldn't hold what he had maintained. Justinian, from Constantinople, seized the moment to launch a reconquest of the West. His general, Belisarius, invaded in 535. What followed was nearly 2 decades of brutal warfare, the Gothic Wars, that devastated Italy. Rome changed hands multiple times. Each siege worsened the damage. When it ended, Italy was nominally back under imperial control, but it was broken. The land was ravaged. Cities were ghost towns. The population had collapsed. The dream of restoring the West died with the effort to do so. Justinian's successors could not hold the gains. In 568, the Lombards invaded Italy, filling the void left by exhausted Byzantine garrisons. Another barbarian kingdom was born. This one more fragmented, more entrenched, and less Roman than ever before. By the close of the 6th century, no one called themselves Roman outside of Constantinople. In the West, the term had become vague, nostalgic, a word that meant old ways, old laws, or civilized, but not a living empire. The political structure was gone, the military framework erased. Even the urban culture that had defined Rome, markets, forums, amphitheaters, had vanished or been repurposed. The fall of the Roman Empire was not a single moment. It was a series of absences, of things that once worked, no longer working, of systems that once functioned, now abandoned. It was not a death. It was a disintegration. And by the time the pieces were noticed, they were already scattered across 1,000 new identities. In place of Rome rose kingdoms, some Christian, some pagan, each claiming fragments of the imperial past. But none could recreate the scale, the reach, or the unity. The age of empire was over in the West. A new age, the medieval, had begun, not with conquest, but with collapse. By the early 7th century, the Western Roman Empire had not only vanished politically, it had vanished from memory in many places. In rural Gaul, peasants no longer spoke of emperors. They spoke of lords. Children were born into a world without maps, without roads, without clocks. The very rhythm of life had changed. Once dictated by imperial administration and civic calendars, it now followed the seasons and the whims of local warlords. The idea of Rome persisted in scripture, in church rituals, in the fading inscriptions carved into cracked stones. But it was no longer something people could see or touch. The breakdown of centralized control meant not just the collapse of governance, but of the infrastructure that had underpinned Roman life for centuries. The great grain fleets from Africa ceased. North Africa, once a supplier of wheat to Italy and Gaul, was now part of the Vandal kingdom, then briefly under Byzantine control and later lost again to Arab conquerors. The granaries emptied. The sea lanes went silent. Trade contracted to local markets. Even salt, once shipped in bulk along imperial roads, became rare and valuable. With the disintegration of economic networks came the collapse of monetary systems. The gold solidus, the backbone of imperial commerce, disappeared from the West. Coinage ceased in many regions, or was replaced by crude, local mint producing debased currency. People returned to barter. Land became the main currency of wealth and power. Titles like dux and comes, once used for Roman military and administrative officials, were now adopted by warlords, stripped of their original meaning, and repurposed as markers of private dominance. Education, too, faltered. Literacy, once widespread among the elite and essential for bureaucratic function, became rare. In places like Britain, after the Roman withdrawal, even basic knowledge of Latin vanished within a generation. Monumental inscriptions went unread. Libraries were looted or rotted in abandoned cities. Without a literate bureaucracy, laws became oral traditions remembered by local judges or priests. Roman law codes survived in monastic scriptoria, but they were no longer living documents. They were relics. As literacy faded, so did the calendar. The great civic holidays of Rome were forgotten. The names of the months lost their imperial associations. Instead, people marked time by feasts of saints, local festivals, and natural cycles. Christianity had preserved a sense of sacred time. Easter, Lent, Christmas, but the secular time of emperors and edicts was gone. No more consular dates, no more imperial anniversaries. Time itself was localized, fragmented, and sacred. The cities, once centers of Roman civilization, declined to shadows of their former selves. Trier, once a capital of the western provinces, shrank from tens of thousands to a few hundred inhabitants huddled within crumbling walls. Alls, once a vibrant hub of administration, commerce, and culture, became a fortified village surrounded by ruins. Theaters and forums were stripped for stone. Marble was burned to make lime. Bronze was melted down for tools and weapons. The great monuments of Rome were not destroyed in a single act. They were mined over centuries by people trying to survive. Yet not all was lost. In monasteries, the slow copying of texts continued. Latin persisted among the clergy. In isolated pockets, the writings of Virgil, Cicero, and Augustine survived, barely. The church became the sole guardian of memory, the last institutional heir of Rome. Bishops became judges, administrators, and negotiators. Monasteries became centers of agriculture, production, and literacy. Where once the Roman state had ensured food distribution, now the monastery fed the poor. Where once the imperial bureaucracy had recorded births and deaths, now baptismal records and burial registers filled the void. The idea of Rome remained potent, even as the reality faded. Germanic kings styled themselves as inheritors of Roman authority. Theodoric called himself Rex Italiae, but ruled from Ravenna in Roman fashion. Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity and received the blessing of the Pope, not because he was Roman, but because he wanted the legitimacy Rome once carried. Even the barbarian laws written down in the post-Roman kingdoms were littered with Latin terms, despite being drafted in Germanic tongues. This was the paradox of post-Roman Europe. Rome had fallen, but everything that came after still lived in its shadow. Roads were neglected, but many still followed Roman routes. Fortresses were built using Roman techniques. Churches reused Roman bricks. Latin had ceased to be a spoken language, but it endured as the language of liturgy, scholarship, and administration, albeit increasingly mispronounced, misunderstood, and transformed into new vernaculars. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, still claimed to rule the world. But by the 7th century, it too was under siege. The Arab conquest swept through Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The empire lost its richest provinces. The loss of Alexandria and Carthage severed it from the intellectual and economic heart of the old Roman world. The Byzantines continued to call themselves Romans, and in many ways they were. But the Rome they defended was no longer the empire of Augustus. It was a Christian, Greek-speaking state under siege, clinging to the memory of unity. And in the West, memory became myth. The great Roman engineering feats, aqueducts, roads, and baths were no longer understood. Locals attributed them to giants or demons or long-lost magical races. The name Rome became a symbol, not a place. A memory of order, of law, of greatness, but no longer a living system. Peasants lived in the ruins, but no longer knew who built them. Kings issued laws, but could not enforce them beyond their own domain. Society became personal, not institutional. The empire had given way to households, war bands, and villages. Rome did not die. It eroded. It seeped into the soil of Europe. Its bones became the foundations of cathedrals. Its language became the roots of new tongues. Its laws, though forgotten, shaped the customs of emerging realms. And its empire, though broken, remained the yardstick by which all future empires would measure themselves. The fall of the Roman Empire was not a cliff. It was a long, uneven slope. 1,000 endings scattered over centuries. A world order that dissolved not in fire and sword alone, but in silence, forgetfulness, and the slow passing of time. By the 8th century, few in the Western lands still living remembered what it was like to be Roman. The empire was now a distant echo, its language distorted into local dialects, its laws folded into custom, its grandeur buried beneath overgrown forums and shattered roads. What persisted was the longing, the idea of Rome, not the substance. The Frankish kingdom, under the Carolingians, was among the first to seize that idea and wield it with purpose. Charles Martel had halted the Muslim advance at Tours in 732. And his son Pepin the Short, eager for legitimacy, sought the Pope's blessing to rule. When Pope Zachary granted it, the old imperial dynamic resurfaced, spiritual authority and political power entwined. In 800 CE, Pepin's son Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. But this was not a revival of Rome. It was a reinvention. The new Roman Empire had no senate, no urban bureaucracy, no centralized administration. It was a patchwork of feudal allegiances bound together by oaths and swords. Charlemagne's court at Aachen mirrored Roman order only in name. Latin was spoken, yes, in church, in law, in record-keeping, but it was no longer understood by the people. His scribes copied Roman texts, his architects mimicked Roman arches, and his advisors referenced Roman law. But the cities were gone. The aqueducts did not run. The empire he ruled was built on horseback, not stone. It could not feed itself from vast granaries or administer justice through professional magistrates. It relied on barons, bishops, and personal loyalty. The rebirth of empire in the West was symbolic, a crown placed on a memory. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Byzantine presence was flickering out. The Lombards, who had invaded in the 6th century, continued to dominate much of the peninsula. Ravenna, once the imperial capital of the West, fell to them in 751. Rome itself became a strange anomaly, politically weak, spiritually powerful. The Pope held no armies but held sway over kings. When the Lombards threatened him, he called on the Franks. When the Franks arrived, they claimed land. Thus was born the Papal States, a theocratic enclave nestled amid fractured kingdoms, sustained by both reverence and opportunism. Outside these centers, the countryside slipped into deep feudalism. The villa system of the late Roman world had hardened into the manorial system. Peasants, now bound to land, owed labor and crops to lords who owned not just their fields, but their futures. The legal freedoms once guaranteed by Roman citizenship were gone. In many places, serfdom became hereditary. Justice was not delivered in courts of law, but in the halls of lords. Trial by ordeal replaced Roman legal reasoning. Education disappeared outside the clergy. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. And yet, Rome persisted, not as governance, but as ambition. Every major European ruler who sought dominion beyond his borders invoked Rome. The Etonian emperors of the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century styled themselves as heirs to Caesar, even though they ruled from Germany and had no real power in Italy. Their coronation by the Pope was a necessary fiction, a symbolic link to a past whose actual machinery they neither possessed nor understood. Even beyond Europe, the memory of Rome haunted ambition. Islamic scholars in Baghdad studied Galen and Ptolemy, translated the legal codes of Justinian, and preserved Roman mathematics and medicine. The Arab caliphates built roads and aqueducts inspired by Roman models. In Al-Andalus, where Visigothic and Roman traditions blended with Islamic rule, a new synthesis of knowledge emerged, one that would eventually feed back into Europe during the Renaissance. But in the core lands of the Western Empire, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, and Italia, the Roman way of life had become unrecognizable. Urban planning was dead. Public health infrastructure, sewers, aqueducts, baths had vanished. Roads were impassable for half the year. Most people lived in wooden structures, surrounded by farmland, isolated from centralized authority. Disease, malnutrition, and war were constant threats. The church alone maintained administrative continuity. Monks in Ireland and Northumbria copied ancient texts. Bishops managed what little infrastructure remained. Pilgrimages kept roads alive. Churches often occupied old Roman temples, not only physically but symbolically, asserting the continuity of divine order. In this way, Christianity became the last thread that tied Europe to its Roman past. Rome had once stretched across continents, enforced law from Britannia to Judea, and governed through roads, legions, and logic. Now it lived in parchment and prayer. Its name evoked authority, but its institutions were ash. The great baths were empty. The fora were cattle pens. The villas were collapsed or repurposed into stones for churches and fortresses. Still, the concept of Romanness endured. To be Roman was to be lawful, civilized, godly. It was a brand of legitimacy claimed by men who had never seen a Roman city. Byzantium, calling itself the Roman Empire until its fall in 1453, clung to titles and traditions even as its language, religion, and culture had long become Greek. In the East, the empire persisted in form, but it too was a relic in function, unable to recapture the unity or scope of the classical world. By the turn of the second millennium, the old Western provinces had fully transformed. Spain was a battlefield between Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirs. France was a mosaic of feudal territories. England, after Viking incursions and Saxon settlement, bore little resemblance to Roman Britain. Italy was a patchwork of city-states, papal lands, and foreign dominions. And yet, every stone road uncovered, every marble column that stood amidst weeds, every inscription deciphered, all whispered the same name: Rome. Its fall had been slow, complex, and mostly silent. No single day marked its end. But over centuries, what had been built through discipline, conquest, law, and order was eroded by apathy, pressure, fragmentation, and change. It was not murdered. It was inherited, and in the hands of its heirs, Germanic kings, Byzantine emperors, Catholic bishops, Islamic scholars, the memory of Rome took on new lives. Each new empire would call itself a new Rome, but none would ever again be the same. By the 11th century, the Western world had fully reoriented itself. The Roman Empire was no longer a political structure anyone served. It was a ghost all rulers chased. Its systems were no longer functioning. They were studied in monasteries. Yet its image, as ruler of the known world, as guardian of law and faith, had become more powerful in absence than it ever was in presence. The physical empire had vanished, but the myth of Rome had calcified into the bedrock of medieval European consciousness. Kings now ruled in the name of God, not of Caesar. But their symbols, their crowns, even their city planning, mimicked what they believed Rome to have been. Churches stood where forums once held markets. Royal charters were written in stylized Latin. And every kingdom, whether the Normans in England, the Capetians in France, or the Christian reconquerors in Spain, justified their rule by imagining continuity with Rome, even when their institutions bore no resemblance to it. The Holy Roman Empire, formally declared in 962 under Otto I, presented the most explicit claim to Rome's mantle. But it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor truly an empire. It was a shifting alliance of German duchies, Italian cities, and Alpine bishoprics, all bound by a shared fiction. Its emperors were crowned in Rome by the Pope, wore regalia modeled after old imperial styles, and invoked Roman legal precedent. Yet they had no standing army, no centralized administration, and only fleeting control over the lands they claimed. Their power was more ceremonial than real, a pageantry rooted in Rome's corpse. Meanwhile, urban life was cautiously returning. In Italy, cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence began to grow. Some had never fully collapsed, protected by geography, by trade, or by sheer luck, and now they thrived on new maritime routes. In these cities, merchants, not warlords, rose to prominence. Trade with the Byzantine Empire, with North Africa, and eventually with the Levant after the Crusades, sparked a new economy. Roman roads were repaired for commerce. Old city walls were rebuilt, and with prosperity came learning. Latin, once kept alive only by monks, found a new audience among clerks, lawyers, and poets. Roman law, preserved in fragments and codices, began to be studied systematically again, first at the University of Bologna in the late 11th century, and then more widely across Europe. The Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, a Byzantine preservation of imperial Roman law, became the basis for a new kind of legal training. Lawyers and judges no longer ruled by custom alone. They now had a theoretical framework rooted in a 1,000-year-old civilization. This legal revival triggered a broader intellectual awakening. Scholars began comparing their own fractured world to the clarity and order they believed Rome had once offered. They saw in the empire not just a memory, but a model. They did not seek to recreate it fully, but they wanted to harness its tools: law, organization, rhetoric, authority. In cathedrals and cloisters, In the newly forming universities, this revival blossomed into what would later become the Renaissance. But the Europe that rose from Rome's ruins was not a rebirth. It was a transformation. The cultural DNA of Rome lived on, in architecture, language, religion, and governance, but it was being reshaped by Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, Islamic, and Christian elements. Feudal hierarchy had replaced the Roman imperial chain of command. Personal bonds of loyalty and vassalage were the norm, not civil service. Land was granted not by a centralized emperor, but negotiated through oaths between lords. This decentralized structure, born out of necessity during Rome's collapse, had hardened into the basic political unit of medieval life. Even the Roman Church had become something else. The Pope ruled not just as Bishop of Rome, but as a feudal lord. The Papal States, secured in the early medieval period, gave the pontiff territorial power. He minted coins, fielded armies, and engaged in diplomacy as any secular ruler would. But spiritually, his authority extended far beyond. When Pope Gregory VII clashed with Emperor Henry IV during the investiture controversy in the 11th century, it was not merely a religious dispute. It was the climax of a centuries-long question. Who now wore the mantle of Rome? The emperor who wielded the sword, or the pope who held the keys? This was the world Rome left behind, one fragmented, yet interconnected by a shared mythos. Pilgrimages crossed old Roman roads. Crusaders marched beneath Roman eagles, redesigned with crosses. Kings sought to marry into bloodlines they claimed stretched back to emperors. In every corner of Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the hills of Castile, Rome's shadow loomed. And yet, in its former core, the Italian peninsula, the memory of empire was personal. Citizens of cities like Milan, Pisa, and Siena began to speak of their communes not just as towns, but as heirs to Roman residential publica. They elected councils, wrote charters, and challenged both imperial and papal claims. They invoked civic freedom not in the medieval sense of feudal rights, but in the Roman sense of collective self-rule. Their walls enclosed not just homes, but ideas. The further one traveled from Italy. However, the more Rome's legacy mutated. In England, Roman ruins were seen as magical, their origins forgotten or misattributed. In the Slavic lands, conversion to Christianity brought Latin letters, Roman saints, and imperial rituals, but no real sense of Roman citizenship. In the Islamic world, especially in the Abbasid Caliphate, Roman science, philosophy, and medicine were absorbed and expanded. Avicenna read Galen. Al-Khwarizmi read Ptolemy. The scholars of Baghdad preserved what the scholars of Gaul had forgotten. By the late 12th century, the Roman Empire was 1,000 years dead in the West, yet its bones still shaped the continent. The legal traditions of Rome underpinned new codes. Its architectural styles re-emerged in the Romanesque and Gothic. Its language, Latin, remained the voice of the educated, the church, the law. Even the way Europeans measured time, with the Julian calendar and Christianized Roman months, owed everything to imperial precedents. Rome did not fall in one year, and did not vanish. It was transmuted into churches, into kingdoms, into languages, into dreams. Its decay birthed not emptiness, but transformation. And in that transformation, in that blending of memory, myth, and matter, Rome achieved what it never could in life: permanence through reinvention. By the 13th century, the bones of Rome still rested beneath the surface of Europe, but the people walking above them were no longer Roman. They were French, English, Italian, Castilian, Saxon, or Norman, identities that would have meant nothing to a Roman official of the 3rd century. Yet the institutions those people were beginning to create still echoed Rome's long-dissolved order. The idea of a republic, of a legal code, of structured administration. These were not reinvented from nothing. They were excavated from memory, preserved in vellum, revived in fragments. In Italy, especially, this revival took a unique form. The northern city-states, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Bologna, were becoming power centers not ruled by feudal lords, but governed by merchant elites, guild councils, and civic assemblies. Their political systems were chaotic and often violent, but they were grounded in the Latin tradition of civitas. They studied Roman law not merely to mimic it, but to legitimize their autonomy from emperors and popes alike. To be Roman now was not to serve an emperor. It was to govern oneself in a city of laws, in the shadow of ruined amphitheaters and basilicas. Roman law, especially the corpus juris civilis, continued to seep into European consciousness. Taught at universities, commented on by legal scholars like Accursius, it provided a structure far superior to the haphazard patchwork of feudal custom. In parts of Europe, particularly in France, the Low Countries, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, codified laws began to replace oral traditions. Even in England, where common law developed along a separate path, Roman legal reasoning influenced the education of judges and the administration of royal courts. Meanwhile, the Roman Church, now at the height of its temporal power, embodied the empire's duality, a spiritual mission fused with institutional order. The papacy had by now adopted full bureaucratic machinery: chanceries, clerks, legates, archives. Papal bulls were issued with the gravitas of imperial edicts. Cardinals operated as ministers. The Pope ruled not only the papal states, but the imagination of Christendom. When Innocent III declared that the Pope stood between God and kings, he was not making a theological statement. He was positioning himself as the new Caesar, crowned not with laurel, but with mitre. This ideological dominion culminated in moments like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where representatives from across Europe gathered to discuss matters of doctrine, governance, and discipline. In effect, an imperial synod under ecclesiastical guise. The language was Roman. The methods were Roman. The goal was order, unity through a shared framework, echoing what the empire had once provided. And yet the material world around these institutions remained fractured. Europe was still a continent of castles and fields, not of cities and provinces. Feudal ties still governed most relationships. Land ownership, military service, and law enforcement were still personal and local. Rome had once been a state that transcended tribe and region. Medieval Europe was a patchwork stitched together with thread spun in Rome, but never reassembled into a single cloth. Crusading further complicated the legacy. When European armies marched east in 1096, and again in subsequent waves, they did so with Roman echoes in their ears. They called themselves pilgrims, but wore crosses on their tunics like imperial standards. They claimed to liberate Jerusalem, as if it were once a Roman province lost to barbarism. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was governed by a mixture of feudal law and Roman precedent, drawing from both the customs of Frankish knights and the administrative memory of Byzantine bureaucracy. Even the Holy Land, Rome was the ghost in the throne room. In Constantinople, that ghost still ruled, though its flesh had aged. The Byzantines of the 13th century still called themselves Romans, but the empire they governed had been shrunk, invaded, and splintered. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, intended to recapture Jerusalem, turned inward and sacked Constantinople itself. Latin knights, many of them unable to read a word of Greek, claimed the throne of the new Rome in a drunken frenzy of looting, betrayal, and blood. The destruction of the city's libraries, relics, and monuments marked one of the final breaches in the continuity of Roman civilization. What had endured since Constantine now lay in ash and theft. Even so, fragments survived. The empire reconstituted itself in Nicaea and later retook Constantinople in 1261, but the damage was permanent. The Byzantines would never again command the resources or authority they once had. They continued for nearly 2 more centuries, a cultural and religious beacon. But the Roman Empire, in its Eastern incarnation, had become a memory moving toward elegy. In the West, the Gothic cathedrals of the 13th century were rising skyward, but their foundations were Roman. Not in style, these were new forms, but in aspiration. The scale, the permanence, the geometry, all were part of an unconscious inheritance. So too with scholasticism. The rediscovery of Aristotle, mediated through Arab scholars and Jewish translators, reawakened interest in logic and philosophy. But even this rediscovery took place in Latin, on the remnants of the Roman educational tradition. Universities, with their degrees, faculties, and formalities, were structurally modeled on Roman civic academies. The languages spoken on the streets, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, were no longer Latin, but their bones were. The verb forms, the vocabulary, even the cadence retained imperial ancestry. The people who spoke them could no longer trace their lineage to Roman citizenship. But every sentence they spoke carried syllables once heard in the Senate, in the markets of Pompeii, and on the lips of soldiers along Hadrian's Wall. By the end of the 13th century, a European could walk through a cathedral and see the ambition of Rome. He could read a legal code and find Roman structure. He could attend a university and be taught in Roman form. He could write in a script descended from Roman cursive. But he would not think of himself as Roman. The empire had become past tense. Its presence had become architecture, not governance, vocabulary, not citizenship, myth, not memory. And yet its hold remained. No ruler in Europe, no matter how powerful, could entirely escape the comparison. Rome had once united the known world. Every king ruled only a part of it. Every emperor, be it of the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine court, lived in its shadow. Its fall was complete, but its echo was louder than ever. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Roman Empire in the West had been gone for over 800 years, but the desire to claim its legacy had not dimmed. It had matured into a political language. Legitimacy in Europe was increasingly measured not by raw conquest or bloodlines alone, but by proximity to Romanitas, the identity, authority, and imagined sanctity of what Rome once represented. In a fractured and war-torn continent, the empire's shadow still determined the shape of power. In Germany and Italy, the Holy Roman emperors of the late medieval period ruled not by force, but by negotiation, ritual, and precedent, all steeped in a legal and symbolic inheritance from Rome. The coronation of emperors remained a sacred rite. Even in the 1300s, rulers like Henry VII or Charles IV made long and dangerous journeys across the Alps, not to conquer Rome, but to be crowned in it. Rome itself was no longer a political capital. It had been reduced to a city of pilgrims, ruins, and priests. But its role as the wellspring of imperial legitimacy remained untouched. To be crowned in Rome by the Pope was to wrap one's rule in the oldest authority known to Christendom. This dynamic reached a complex turning point with the Avignon papacy, 1309 to 1377, when the popes resided in France rather than Rome. The very idea that the Bishop of Rome could rule from elsewhere caused panic. Not just spiritual unease, but political rupture. Rome's authority was geographic. The papacy's authority was divine. The two had always been presented as one. Now, with popes in Avignon, kings began to question the link between divine right and Roman tradition. If Rome could be left behind physically, could its symbolic power be challenged intellectually? The Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in 1347, further weakened the inherited structures of order. Cities with Roman roots, like Florence, Paris, and London, suffered massive death tolls. But the psychological blow went deeper. The empire, in its heyday, had promised order, sanitation, peace, Pax Romana. Now, under the church that claimed to inherit Rome's moral crown, the world fell into chaos. The plague didn't just kill millions. It shattered the perceived protection offered by ancient institutions. Rome had promised eternity. Its heirs delivered apocalypse. And yet, in the wake of this devastation, something stirred. The 14th century also saw the earliest roots of the Renaissance, a rebirth not of Roman politics, but of Roman humanism. In cities like Florence, educated elites began to unearth forgotten texts. Manuscripts of Cicero, Livy, and Lucretius were discovered in dusty monastery libraries, copied and studied. The Latin of Virgil began to be taught not as a dead language of theology, but as a living one of literature and logic. Roman architecture, with its balance, symmetry, and clean lines, was admired anew. The classical past was no longer just a tool of rulers and popes. It became a source of inspiration for artists, scholars, and thinkers. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, lived through the first wave of the Renaissance. He wrote letters addressed to Cicero. He climbed mountains simply for the view, emulating the Roman love of nature and the individual experience. He believed that Rome's greatness had not died, but slept, buried beneath the ignorance of the medieval centuries. He did not want to restore the empire. He wanted to restore the mind of man, as shaped by Roman intellect and beauty. This shift marked a fundamental change in how Rome was remembered. For centuries, Rome had been invoked primarily as an institution, a law, a title, a throne. Now, in the minds of humanists, it became a culture, an ideal, a benchmark of human potential. The empire may have collapsed, but the civilization that built it, its values, its aesthetics, its ambitions, could be reawakened. By the 15th century, this vision had spread. Architects like Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon and began designing domes not unlike those of Imperial Rome. Artists like Donatello and later Michelangelo revived classical sculpture. In their hands, Roman statuary was not replicated, it was reimagined. Proportions, perspective, anatomy, all were drawn from the bones of Roman technique. And in literature, scholars like Lorenzo Valla dissected the Latin of the Vulgate Bible and challenged church authority with the same rhetorical tools Cicero once used against corruption in the Senate. The Renaissance was not a return to Rome, but a transformation of it, a selective resurrection. It brought back the beauty, the balance, the literature, and the civic ideals, but left behind the empire, the conquest, the centralization. Where ancient Rome had sought control over men, Renaissance Rome sought the elevation of man. Rome, in essence, had become human again. Even so, the political use of Rome did not fade. The papacy, threatened by the rise of secular monarchs, doubled down on its Roman identity. Pope Nicholas V, who began rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, called himself not only the successor of Peter, but the heir of Augustus. Rome was to be remade, not as an imperial capital, but as the holy capital of a spiritual empire. This too was a kind of rebirth. Rome's ruins became tourist destinations. Pilgrims wandered beneath broken arches, listening to priests and poets alike explain the grandeur that once was. Meanwhile, European monarchs continued their dance with Rome's legacy. The Spanish monarchy, enriched by the Reconquista and later by exploration, saw itself as a new global power. Ferdinand and Isabella spoke of empire not in medieval terms, but in Roman ones. Their armies marched with crosses, but their vision of rule echoed imperium, a civilization guided by law, conversion, and destiny. When they sent Columbus west, they believed they were extending the map first drawn by Roman geographers. In England, too, Rome's legacy was being reforged. The Tudor court saw in Rome a mirror for its centralization. Henry VIII, breaking with the papacy, did not reject Rome entirely. He replaced one Roman legacy with another. He declared himself head of the church in England and styled his court in Roman terminology. Statues, coins, and public rituals evoked imperial imagery. The court poets spoke of Britannia and Caesar in flattering terms. Rome was not abolished, it was rebranded. By the end of the 15th century, as Europe teetered on the edge of modernity, the legacy of Rome had become too large to escape. It was no longer just a memory. It was a framework, one that shaped cities, courts, faith, language, and art. Rome had not risen again, but it had risen within. What had begun as an empire of roads and legions had become an empire of ideas. And unlike marble or bronze, ideas do not crumble. They replicate, they mutate, they endure. Rome's fall was real. Its dissolution was complete. But its reappearance in every courtroom, every cathedral, every painted dome and measured line, that was the truest conquest it ever made. By the 16th century, Rome's legacy had begun a final metamorphosis, from foundation of legitimacy to ideological battleground. The classical past was no longer just the property of kings, popes, or poets. It had become the backdrop for revolution, reformation, and the birth of modern nation-states. The ruins of empire, once passive scenery for religious pilgrimage or artistic inspiration, now crackled with intellectual fire. Europe was no longer merely inheriting Rome. It was interrogating it. This new tension was perhaps most visible in the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he was not just challenging church corruption. He was questioning the Roman system that underpinned Western Christendom. The church had styled itself as a continuation of the Roman Empire, with popes seated in the city of the Caesars, issuing decrees in Latin, claiming authority over all of Christendom. Luther attacked this edifice not only with theological arguments, but with the language of history. He accused the church of having betrayed the simplicity of early Christianity, of having replaced apostolic poverty with imperial grandeur. Rome, in this context, became not a source of legitimacy, but a symbol of decadence and tyranny. Reformers across Europe joined in. Calvin in Geneva, Zwingli in Zurich, Knox in Scotland. They all painted Rome as Babylon, the whore, the corrupt core of a false religious empire. And yet, paradoxically, they too were shaped by Roman forms. Protestant churches still used Roman legal frameworks in their new ecclesiastical structures. Reformed theologians wrote in Latin, debated using methods derived from Roman rhetoric, and built seminaries that mimicked Roman education. Even as they tore down papal claims, they stood on Roman foundations. At the same time, humanists pushed deeper into Roman antiquity. Scholars like Erasmus combed classical texts for moral clarity, re-editing ancient manuscripts, including the New Testament, with philological precision born from Roman grammatical traditions. They saw in ancient Rome not just power, but moral insight. The Roman Republic, in particular, became a point of fascination. Cicero's ideals of liberty, civic virtue, and resistance to tyranny appealed strongly to a generation watching monarchs centralize authority across Europe. In Florence, Machiavelli penned The Prince and Discourses on Livy, works that looked to Rome not as a golden age to be worshipped, but as a case study in power, resilience, and political manipulation. His Roman references were clinical, brutal, and honest. He admired Rome not for its moral superiority, but for its capacity to endure and dominate. For Machiavelli, Roman greatness had come not from virtue alone, but from necessity, blood, and contingency. As early modern Europe expanded its reach, the language of empire followed. Spain, newly dominant after the conquest of the Americas, referred to its overseas territories as part of a residential publica Christiana, echoing Roman ideals of ordered rule. The Spanish crown commissioned legal codes for the New World modeled in part on Roman jurisprudence. Missionaries brought not only crosses, but Latin grammars. Latin America would be named for the language of empire, even as it was conquered under the flag of a Spanish king. In England, too, imperial thinking drew from Roman precedent. As the Tudor monarchy tightened its grip, it reshaped its identity through both classical learning and architectural mimicry. Elizabeth I was painted as a new Caesar, reigning over a Britannia reborn. Shakespeare's history plays often leaned into Roman parallels, portraying British monarchs as successors to an imperial tradition. His Julius Caesar was not just about the Ides of March, but a meditation on tyranny, populism, and political decay, a mirror to contemporary anxieties. Colonial projects in North America later borrowed heavily from Roman themes. The term Senate, the use of Latin mottos, the architectural vocabulary of domes and columns, all were deliberate callbacks to Rome. Even the legal frameworks governing colonial charters and land rights often drew from Roman concepts of natural law, terra nullius, and civic obligation. Meanwhile, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, launched in response to Protestant critiques, leaned even more heavily on Rome's heritage. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, took place in the Italian heartland. Its decrees reaffirmed papal supremacy, Latin liturgy, and hierarchical authority. Jesuit education, which rapidly spread across Catholic Europe and into the colonies, was deeply infused with classical learning. Students studied Latin rhetoric, Roman history, and imperial philosophy as part of their religious training. To be a good Catholic was, in many ways, to be a new kind of Roman, disciplined, articulate, loyal to the Pope as one once was to the Emperor. In the arts, the High Renaissance reached its apex in Rome. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling not in the style of medieval saints, but of Roman gods. Raphael's school of Athens assembled pagan philosophers in a Vatican hall, suggesting continuity rather than contradiction. St. Peter's Basilica rose not merely as a church, but as a monumental echo of the Roman pantheon. Its dome, the largest in the world, deliberately asserting that Christian Rome had eclipsed pagan Rome, not abandoned it. By the early 17th century, Europe was clearly no longer Roman in any literal sense, but it had become deeply Roman in style, in structure, and in aspiration. Rome had transformed from an empire into a toolkit, one that could be used by monarchs and revolutionaries, popes and heretics, artists and architects. The memory of its fall had faded, but the materials of its rise were everywhere. The early modern world saw in Rome not a dead past, but a living arsenal. The language of empire, of order, of legitimacy continued to pass through Latin grammar, legal treatises, and architectural blueprints. Rome was not only a place or a memory, it had become a metaphor for civilization itself. And the more distant its fall became, the more clearly its influence could be seen. Rome, once reduced to rubble and silence, had returned, not as a polity, but as a civilization reimagined on new soil.